Hi there. Hello, everybody. This is Tony Annett here. Um, it's a great privilege to be able to address you at your symposium, even though I unfortunately cannot be with you in person. It's a privilege for me to do this through recorded video. So today, what I would like to do is talk about uh, Catholic social teaching and sustainable development, with particular attention to what Pope Francis has to say about this important topic. Now, let's start off with some preliminaries. What is sustainable development? Well, sustainable development basically says you can no longer just have a single economic pillar based on economic growth. You also need to look at things like social inclusion and environmental sustainability. So we can say that sustainable development has three pillars. The first pillar is the economic pillar, which says that you allow the market economy and technological progress to develop prosperity in a way that all can benefit from, and all from benefit from is key there. And the second pillar is the pillar of social inclusion or economic rights. That says that people have the right to such good as food, clothing, housing, education, healthcare, clean water and sanitation, clean energy, decent and rewarding work. All of these things are human rights, according to this second pillar of sustainable development. And the third pillar of sustainable development is the environmental pillar. And this basically is predicated on the need to protect nature, to prevent climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, and the destruction of ecosystems, things like that, the protection of nature. Now, Catholic social teaching has a lot to say about these three pillars of sustainable development. But let me start off by explaining to you what exactly Catholic social teaching is. Now, you're at a Catholic school, so you probably know what this is, but nonetheless, I'll just give a quick explanation. Catholic social teaching is basically a set of encyclicals written by popes, ranging from Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII in 1891, all the way through to Fratelli Tutti, written by Pope Francis in 2020. And these encyclicals, what they try to do is they take timeless moral principles, principles that flow from the Gospels, from the early church, from Thomas Aquinas, and try and apply these principles to modern economic challenges. In the late 19th century, those challenges included the Industrial Revolution, when you had people moving from the land into factories, and often in atrocious working conditions, low wages, long working hours, a lack of safety, a lack of basic human dignity. And Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum and basically says this is morally problematic, that it's okay to have a market economy, it's okay to have industrialization, but there needs to be an element of morality around this. You need to respect the dignity of your workers. You need to grant workers rights, including the rights to join unions and to strike. These are all important workers' rights. And after that seminal encyclical, Rerum Novarum, you had a sequence of encyclicals written after that, responding to particular challenges of the time. In 1931, you had an encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which basically responded to the Great Depression and the huge collapse in economies all over the world and spikes in unemployment. And then after the Second World War, you had Pope John the 23rd, the great Pope of the Second Vatican Council, who issued two encyclicals, one, Mater et Magistra, Mother and Teacher, on kind of economic justice, and another called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, about how to achieve world peace, written during the worst and most dangerous period of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union came to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in 1967, Pope John's successor, Pope Paul VI, issued an encyclical called Popularum Progressio on the development of peoples, which talks about what development is really like. And he said it's not just about economic growth, it's about what he called integral human development, the development of the whole person in all his or her dimensions, and the development of all people in the world, no matter which country they're born into. And then we have the 27-year pontificate of Pope John Paul II. He wrote 3 major social encyclicals. In 1981, he wrote Laborem Exercens on the dignity of work. He talked about the importance of work for the human person and the importance of workers' rights. And this is also an important dimension of sustainable development. Then in 1987, he wrote an encyclical called On Social Concerns, which again followed up on the theme of Pope Paul VI on the need for a kind of a more cohesive approach to development, including the development of underdeveloped countries. And then in 1991, he wrote an encyclical called Centesimus Annus on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which was written in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the final defeat of communism. You're all too young to remember that, but I remember well that period when the once unassailable Soviet Union suddenly was no more. And Pope John Paul II tried to assess that moment morally. And he basically argued that the market economy was now the only game in town, but it could not be just a free, liberated market. It had to be encased within a firm moral boundary. It had to respect the rights, the human rights of peoples, and to grant rights to people who don't have the ability to meet their needs on the market. Then in 2009, Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict, who just died recently, issued an encyclical called Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth, which was written in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And he is arguing there for a kind of a complete reimagining of the global economy to focus less on self-interest and more on fraternity and solidarity, and more on helping our neighbors in need in every market and economic transaction. Quite radical when you think about it. Then comes our beloved Pope Francis. In 2015, he issued his encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, which is an important social encyclical. I would call it a moral charter for sustainable development. And he talks a lot there about how to protect nature, to care for the environment. And I'll talk a bit about that encyclical later on in this talk. And finally, in 2020, Pope Francis issued an encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, brothers and sisters all, which again goes back to the theme of Pope John the 23rd on how to achieve peaceful coexistence between different peoples and cultures in the world based on fraternity, a profoundly beautiful meditation on human fraternity. So that in about 5 minutes is a very quick history of Catholic social teaching. So what I want to do in this talk is to take those principles and apply them to the challenges of sustainable development. So let's look at the 3 pillars of sustainable development. The first pillar is the market economy, which I've said needs to be encased within a firm moral boundary. Now, that has implications for how we look at the economy. And I'm going to list 7 or 8 of them really quickly. The first principle, the first caveat to the market economy is it says that free markets cannot just run amok on their own. They need to be governed by what's called a firm governing directing principle. And that comes from Pope Pius XI in 1931. He said the right ordering of economic life cannot be left to a free competition of forces. It must be subjected to and governed by a true and effective directing principle. Now, this goes against kind of the essence of free market economics from people like Adam Smith, which says that self-interest and the market economy leads to socially good outcomes, needs a directing principle. Second caveat is that the market cannot be based solely on self-interest. It must be guided by such values and virtues as solidarity, fraternity, reciprocity, and gratuitousness. The idea of doing something for your neighbor, not expecting anything in return just because you want to will the good of your neighbor in itself. That's kind of radical, a radical way of looking at the economy, but it's kind of essential to Catholic social teaching. And this outlook is most associated with Pope Benedict XVI. The third caveat says that there are many needs that cannot be met on the market, and these needs must be satisfied. This is associated with Pope John Paul II. He made this point. There are many goods which the market cannot provide or the market will not provide. There are many goods that the market will only provide if you're rich enough to afford those goods. Whereas goods like food, shelter, clean water and sanitation, clean energy, healthcare, education, these are the goods of sustainable development, and they must be made available to all people. Fourth caveat, the government has a special duty to protect the poor and workers. Pope Leo XIII, back in 1891, says the rich are perfectly able to protect themselves. They don't need the state to help them. They're good on their own. But the poor and the worker, they need the state to help them because they can't protect themselves on the market. They're vulnerable. And Catholic social teaching always prizes and prioritizes the most vulnerable in society. So protect the poor and protect workers. The fifth caveat, Catholic social teaching rejects kind of the neoliberal approach to the market economy of trickle-down economics, which says that if you make the rich richer, that will trickle down and help everybody in society. The popes have said that this is a morally problematic assumption. We shouldn't believe it, and we shouldn't do it. And yeah, and that's associated in particular with Pope Francis. He has made that very explicit. Sixth caveat, the role of business is not just about maximizing profits, as is assumed too often by our society and in the way we teach economics. Whereas business should be responsible to a whole variety of stakeholders, including customers, workers, consumers, and the environment and society at large. And Pope Benedict talked about why can't we have businesses that can make profits and conduct a social purpose at the same time, be socially valuable. Why not? Seventh caveat, Catholic social teaching emphasizes the dignity of work and workers' rights. This is essential for sustainable development. As Pope Francis puts it, work is a necessity, part of the meaning of life on this earth, a path to growth, human development, and personal fulfillment. This gives a moral injunction to prioritize decent, dignified work. Decent, dignified work, not horrible, low-paid work with no protections and an insecure working environment. Work where dignity is affirmed and when people can develop their capacities and become the people God has made them to be. Eighth caveat, again from Pope Francis, we need a form of progress that goes beyond economic growth. I mentioned Pope Paul VI and his emphasis on integral human development. And Pope Francis calls for, in Laudato Si, a form of development which is healthier, more human, more social, and more integral. He says that the idea of infinite growth is based on a lie that there is an infinite supply of the Earth's resources, and that leads to the planet being squeezed dry and creates all kinds of environmental havoc. So we need a new form of economic growth. Now, Pope Francis is quite prophetic in some of his remarks. He basically says, and I'll read you some things he says. He says that, this system, this market economy, has imposed the mentality of profit at any price, with no concern for social exclusion or the destruction of nature. He says an unfettered pursuit of money rules. This is the dung of the devil. Yes, he actually used the phrase dung of the devil. And in another passage, he says the worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. And in one of his most prophetic statements, which I find very powerful, he says, let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality, where money rules rather than serves. That economy kills, that economy excludes, that economy destroys Mother Earth. Very powerful indictment of our current global economy, which pays no heed to how we treat our fellow human beings and pays no heed to how we treat nature. So that's kind of the moral dimension of the first pillar of sustainable development, which is the market economy. What about the second pillar of sustainable development, which is economic rights? Well, what are rights? Well, a right is simply a claim that other people are obliged to accept. We frequently think of political and civil rights, rights like the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. But what I'm talking about here are economic rights, the rights to the goods of human flourishing, such as food, shelter, healthcare, education, clean water, sanitation, clean energy. All these are human rights according to Catholic social teaching. These rights are often seen as codified in a profoundly brilliant 1948 document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was shepherded through by a remarkable woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who you probably have heard of. And it reflects a cross-cultural consensus on the importance of human rights rooted in the dignity and worth of every human being. And Catholic social teaching had a crucial input into the development of human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in particular with economic rights, which is what I want to talk about. Now, the Pope who talked most about economic rights was Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris, that encyclical I mentioned on world peace. He also talks about human rights. Here are the first rights he lists in that encyclical. The first rights, the most important rights. Man has the right to live, so the right to life comes first. After that, though, he has the right to bodily integrity and to the means necessary to the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally, the necessary social services. In consequence, he has the right to be looked after in the event of ill health, disability stemming from his work, widowhood, old age, enforced unemployment, or whatever through no fault of his own, he is deprived of the means of his livelihood. They are the first rights listed by Catholic social teaching, and they are almost predominantly economic rights. He goes on to list other rights, including the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to be given the opportunity to work, the right to own property, and the right to a just wage. So a few points are in order. The first point is that the primary rights in Catholic social teaching are economic rights, not political rights, not civil rights, they're economic rights. And they are always twinned with duties. Now, in one sense, if you have a right, then somebody to a certain good, then somebody else, perhaps the state, has a duty to provide that good. If you have a right to healthcare, for example, or to education, somebody has the duty to provide that healthcare or education to you. It might be the government, it might be the private sector, but somebody has to provide it. But there are also duties in the person itself, in the rights holders itself. So in other words, if you have a right, you also have a corresponding duty. For example, if you have the right to be given the opportunity to work and to a just wage, you have a duty to work diligently, to support your family, to pay your taxes, and to contribute to society. With every right, there's a corresponding duty. This is central to Catholic social teaching, and it differs quite a bit from how the secular world sees human rights. Okay. Human rights, or economic rights, feed into a crucial principle of Catholic social teaching known as the universal destination of goods. This is the notion that the goods of the earth are destined for all people without exception, without exclusion, not merely the rich, not merely the well-connected, not really those who have the financial resources to afford the goods and services needed to live a dignified life. Everybody. Now, that has profound implications for how we look at private property. For Catholic social teaching says that private property rights are not absolute, but they're conditional. And they're conditional on the needs of all people being met. Pope John Paul II said that private property always comes with a social mortgage. Pope Francis said the right to private property is only a secondary natural right, not a primary natural right, a secondary natural right. So Catholic social teaching tries to balance the private and the social dimension of property. And that balance can be best achieved by recognizing and guaranteeing economic rights. And for that reason, Catholic social teaching avoids the two extremes of free market ideology, free market libertarianism on one hand, and communist collectivism on the other hand. You avoid those two extremes, what Pope Pius XI called the twin rocks of shipwreck. You want to avoid both libertarianism, individualism, and communist collectivism. Okay. The universal destination of goods, and this is crucial for sustainable development, creates a moral injunction for richer countries to support the development of poorer countries. So Pope Paul VI says, no nation may dare to hoard its riches for its own use alone. It needs to be able to share those resources with poorer countries. And Pope John Paul II criticized the juxtaposition of underdevelopment and poverty with what he called a consumerist super development, where rich people wallow in luxury while poor people basically live in great situations of great suffering on less than $2 a day. 700 million people in the world live in extreme poverty today. That's kind of stunning in such a rich world as we have. So this calls for solidarity between countries, not just solidarity within countries. So that is the second pillar of Catholic social teaching, the pillar of economic rights based on the universal destination of goods. You must meet the basic needs of all people. The third pillar, possibly of greater interest to you today, is the environmental pillar, the sustainability pillar, the protection of nature pillar. And this is where I want to talk in some detail about Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's profound and prophetic encyclical on care for our common home. Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si in response to what he saw as the mistreatment of our common home. And he refers to our common home as our mother and our sister. And we are treating our mother and our sister abominably. We're despoiling nature. It's shameful. For Pope Francis, he argues that the Christian tradition calls for us all to live in deep harmony with nature. There is a biblical injunction to have dominion over creation, but that can be misinterpreted, giving rise to a warrant to mistreat nature as we see fit. Pope Francis calls this disordered anthropocentrism, putting ourselves first in a disordered way. And this has brought us to the present moment. The original harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation has been ruptured, has been ripped apart, and this disruption has been brought about by human greed, hubris, arrogance, and selfishness. The biblical mandate, says Pope Francis, is to till it and to keep it. But humanity has tended to till too much and to keep too little. As Pope Francis says, and I quote here, each community can take from the bounty of the earth whatever it needs for its subsistence, but it also has the duty to protect the earth and to ensure its fruitfulness for coming generations. In other words, he says, the environment is both a legacy from our parents and a loan from our children, which gives rise to a profound sense of intergenerational solidarity. And this, by the way, is another example of the universal destination of goods, because the needs of future generations must also be met, and we can't meet the needs of future generations if we destroy nature, if we destroy the natural world. But there's a caveat there. Pope Francis goes even further than that and says, it's not just about allowing nature to provide a flourishing life for all human beings. Pope Francis says, yes, that's important, but there's a deeper issue here, that creatures do not exist just to serve humanity. They have their own value, purpose, and destiny. And Pope Francis uses some very profoundly beautiful language to express this. This attitude of reverence and awe before creation, and very much in line with Gerard Manley Hopkins, I would say. If we approach nature without this openness of awe and wonder, says Pope Francis, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, then our attitude will be that of masters and consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. Pope Francis then goes on to diagnose the state of our common home, which he says is in a disastrous state, actually. He discusses pollution in blunt terms, saying the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Now, it's very rare in a papal encyclical you will find phrases like an immense pile of filth. It's Pope Francis's very direct style of writing. He also talks about climate change, acknowledging the scientific consensus that says the rise in global temperatures is due to human beings burning fossil fuels. He blames an extractivist economic model that pays no heed to environmental harms. And climate change is particularly devastating for the poor because they live in the areas on the front line of climate change. They rely on livelihoods that suffer most from climate change, and they lack the social protection to protect them from the fallout from climate change. And to add insult to injury, the poor are not the ones contributing to climate change. That's us, that's the rich world. They don't contribute to the carbon emissions at all, and yet they're suffering most from it. This is a grave injustice, according to Laudato Si, according to Pope Francis. He also talks about the human right to safe drinking water. He said that's a basic and universal human right, since it is essential for human survival and is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. But that right is threatened today because in many parts of the world you have water shortages, and water is being polluted and spoiled by farming, mining, and industry. And he spends a lot of time talking about biodiversity, the intricate web of life which is being destroyed. And here I think he's at his most prophetic. He says, because of us, he says, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right. We have no such right, he says. This gets to the heart of Pope Francis' view that the environment itself has rights, both because we are intimately connected with the environment, with nature, and because all creatures have intrinsic value in their own right. Now, Laudato Si is at its most powerful in offering an ethical diagnosis of the environmental crisis. For Pope Francis, the fault lies with what he calls a technocratic paradigm combined with a sense of individualism that puts blind faith in the market. The problem, he says, lies with a myth of modernity grounded in the utilitarian mindset, by which he means, and I quote him, individualism, unlimited progress, competition, consumerism, the unregulated market. This technocratic paradigm centers on the idea that all economic intervention should be judged in terms of efficiency and utility, not in terms of the dignity and worth of human beings and nature. And yet Pope Francis says this technocratic paradigm dominates our politics, it dominates our economic activity, and it justifies the emphasis on constant economic growth that does not respect the limits of nature. This is an inherently confrontational vision based on an ethos of mastery, transformation, and possession. It looks at nature as an external object to be manipulated and controlled, not as a common home that should support our communal flourishing. It is a distorted anthropocentrism, a Promethean vision of mastery where human beings misunderstand their relationship to the natural order. And this caused Francis to say that our immense technological development, and technology has worked wonders in the world, it's brought wonders, but our immense technological development has not been accompanied by the development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. This is a searing indictment of our modern economy and the values that underpin it. Now, the result of this technocratic paradigm attached to this unlimited human power is a relativism which sees everything as irrelevant unless it serves our own immediate needs. It's all about immediate convenience and instant gratification, leading people to exploit nature and our fellow human beings in the service of self-interest. This is the ultimate root of the twin social and environmental crisis. It has many practical manifestations, ranging from gross evils like forced labor and modern forms of slavery, all the way through to disordered consumerism and a naive belief in the invisible forces of the market. All of this leads to Pope Francis's signature diagnosis, the throwaway culture. The throwaway culture is where people and things are used to satisfy our immediate needs, our immediate convenience, and then thrown away when they no longer serve any value or any use to us. This not only leads to the destruction of nature, but it leads to a profound sense of exclusion for the poor and the marginalized, where these people are, as Pope Francis says, those excluded are no longer society's underside or its fringes or its disenfranchised. They are no longer even part of it. The excluded are not the exploited, but the outcast, the leftovers. Excuse me. Now, Pope Francis offers a profound moral diagnosis, but he doesn't leave things there. He also calls for solutions. Now, he calls for sustainable development, which is why it's so important to us here today. What he calls an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. That is sustainable development in a nutshell. When it comes to solutions, the starting point for Pope Francis is the need for ecological conversion, to break free of consumerism, individualism, and self-centeredness. He calls for a new ecological citizenship, infused with ecological virtues. Now, these efforts can be small, but doing them can lead to larger ripple effects in society as our good example leads to other people mirroring our good example and spreading more widely throughout society. Pope Francis lists some examples: avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, separating refuse, cooking only what can be reasonably consumed, showing care for other living things, using public transport or carpooling, planting trees, turning off unnecessary lights, or any other number of things. But there's an important caveat to that. Individual efforts are not enough. He says self-improvement on the part of individuals will not by itself remedy the extremely complex situation facing our world today. We need institutional and political solutions at the international level, at the national level, and at the local level. As Laudato Si says very clearly, interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Here, we can talk about climate change, because Pope Francis says that the technology based on highly polluting fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas need to be progressively replaced without delay. But Pope Francis says the pace of change here is too slow because action is being hindered by strong vested interests, people who make a lot of money from this fossil fuel economy. He says this entails a failure of conscience and responsibility. Laudato Si was written before the Paris Agreement on climate change, but had a major input into its ongoing negotiations. Laudato Si also calls for business too to play a role in protecting the environment and promoting sustainable development. Now, this comes with a positive and a negative injunction. On the negative side, companies are called upon to refrain from polluting, destroying biodiversity, or contributing to climate change in a way that violates the Paris Agreement. The social and environmental costs of using shared environmental resources, says Pope Francis, must be recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them, not by other people's or future generations. In other words, do not pass off the environmental costs of your economic activity onto society or future generations. Only then, he says, can economic activity be considered ethical. So with that in mind, we need to ask ourselves how much economic activity in the world today would be considered unethical based on these criteria. That's the negative side, but there's also a positive side. Laudato Si says businesses are called upon to deploy their creativity and ingenuity in the service of sustainable development solutions. This will entail a shift in emphasis from short-run profits to longer-term sustainable development. Laudato Si says this can be worthwhile. Efforts to promote a sustainable use of natural resources, it says, are not a waste of money, and more diversified and innovative forms of production which impact less on the environment can prove very profitable. So Pope Francis says there's also a positive injunction. And if business does this, it can live up to its calling as a noble profession. So that's the role of business. So we've seen the role of the international community in rallying around the Paris Agreement on climate change. We've seen the role of national governments in implementing these agreements at the national level and moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy. And we've seen the role of business in terms of using its resources to promote sustainable development and refrain from hurting the environment. There's one more element here, which I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the role of civil society. Pope Francis says civil society can play a vital role in spurring environmental action. And I quote him here. He says they can draw public attention to these issues and offer critical cooperation, employing legitimate means of pressure to ensure that each government carries out its proper and inalienable responsibility to preserve its country's environment and natural resources without capitulating to spurious local or international interests. So civil society can hold the government's feet to the fire, as it were, in terms of spurring it for moral environmental action. Pope Francis also praises consumer boycotts that use boycotts of certain goods and industries in a way to sway public opinion or change behavior. These boycotts, he claims, can change the way businesses operate by forcing them to consider their environmental footprint and their patterns of production. He says when social pressure affects their earnings, businesses clearly have to find ways to produce differently. As he puts it, purchasing is not just an economic act, it is also a moral act. And here perhaps we could single out the issue of fossil fuel divestment, where people in their pension funds and other investments seek not to invest in fossil fuels, but to invest in more renewable technologies instead to spur the green economy. Every economic decision is actually a moral decision. So the bottom line then from this perspective is that the grave environmental crisis requires an urgent ethical and moral response from all actors, international organizations, all levels of government, businesses, civil society, and individuals. Only then can society rally around the common good as encapsulated in the concept of sustainable development. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis shows us exactly how this can be done. So that's my talk for today. That's what I wanted to leave with you. And just to sum up, I would say that sustainable development maps out the contours of the global common good. It's what our global economy and our global politics needs to rally around today to support the common good and our communal human flourishing. These are encapsulated in the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which begin with ending poverty as a moral obligation. Sustainable development has 3 pillars. The economic pillar, which says, let the market economy and technology further prosperity in a way that benefits all people. And as we saw in Catholic social teaching, this has a lot of caveats in terms of protecting the needs of all people and making sure the market is bound by a moral boundary. The second pillar we saw was economic rights, the rights to such goods as food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, clean water, sanitation, clean energy, decent work, dignified work, just wages. Things like this are all considered economic rights. They're considered human rights, and they are reflective of the universal destination of goods, that we need to use our property to make sure that the needs of all people are met, including in the poorest countries of the world. And again, that points to sustainable development and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, there is the third pillar of sustainable development. That's the pillar of protecting nature. And in a sense, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, issued in 2015, is devoted most specifically to this third pillar, to protect the protection of nature, a crucial part of sustainable development. Though, of course, as Pope Francis says, we cannot fully separate the environmental crisis from the social and economic crisis because they are connected. He calls us to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, because in a sense, that cry comes from the same source. And with that, I thank you all for listening to me. I hope you got something out of this. I appreciate very much being asked to contribute to your symposium. And I wish you all the best for the rest of your symposium and all your future endeavors. God bless, and thank you very much.